She called him just the help at her own company party, not knowing his grandfather's blood was mixed into the concrete of every building she claimed to own. Picture this: the crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the marble floor of Sterling Holdings' 40th floor penthouse as Detroit's elite mingled with champagne flutes and calculated smiles. 24-year-old Marcus Washington moved through the crowd like smoke, refilling glasses and clearing plates with the practiced invisibility that came with wearing a black vest and bow tie in a room full of people who looked right through him. Now here's what those guests didn't know. Nobody knew Marcus belonged in this room more than any of them. Not as the help, but as the rightful heir to an empire that had been stolen from his family 3 generations ago. "Excuse me, boy," snapped a sharp voice behind him. Marcus turned to see Victoria Sterling, the 45-year-old CEO of Sterling Holdings. Picture her, platinum blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, ice blue eyes looking at him like he was a stain on her Persian rug. "The glasses on table 12 need attention. Try to keep up." Marcus nodded politely. "Of course, ma'am." But as he walked away, something burned in his chest that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with recognition. This woman, this company, this building, they all belonged to his family. You see, the truth lived in a shoebox under his grandmother's bed, carefully preserved in yellow documents and faded photographs that told a story of betrayal, theft, and systematic destruction. Washington Construction Company had been the most successful black-owned business in Detroit history, until a carefully orchestrated campaign of lies, legal manipulation, and outright fraud had transferred everything to a young white businessman named Charles Sterling, Victoria's father. Marcus refilled champagne glasses with steady hands while his mind replayed his grandmother's words from that morning: "Baby, your grandfather would be proud to see you getting your education. But he'd be even prouder if you finally got back what they stole from us." At 86, Grandma Ruby still remembered every detail of the day they lost everything. How Charles Sterling had convinced the bank that James Washington was embezzling from his own company. How forged documents suddenly appeared showing debts that never existed. How the newspapers ran stories about the unreliable African-American contractor, while Sterling swooped in to buy the company assets for pennies on the dollar. "Now watch this unfold. The help seems distracted tonight," Victoria Sterling announced loudly to her inner circle, her voice carrying across the room as Marcus approached their table. "I specifically requested competent staff for this event." Her companions, all white, all wealthy, all completely comfortable with her casual cruelty, laughed appreciatively. Marcus felt every eye in the vicinity turn toward him, some with pity, others with the gleeful anticipation of watching someone be humiliated. "I apologize if my service has been inadequate," Marcus said, his voice level and professional despite the fire building in his chest. Victoria looked him up and down with theatrical disgust. "Where did you even learn to serve? Did someone actually train you, or are you just winging it like most of your people do?" The room fell silent. Even the other wealthy guests seemed uncomfortable with the naked racism hanging in the air like poison gas. But Victoria Sterling felt untouchable in her own building, surrounded by her own employees, drunk on her own power. Marcus set down his tray with deliberate care. When he looked up, there was something in his dark brown eyes that made Victoria take an unconscious step backward. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I learned to serve from my grandmother, who learned it from watching my grandfather build this entire city. Including this building we're standing in right now." The words hung in the air like a challenge, but Victoria was too arrogant to understand their significance. She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. How precious. Another delusional black boy with fantasies about his family's imaginary legacy. Security. But Marcus was already walking away, his mind now crystal clear about what needed to be done. Victoria Sterling had just made the mistake of humiliating the wrong man at the wrong time. She thought she was untouchable, protected by her wealth and her position. She had no idea that Marcus Washington had spent 4 years studying business law specifically to learn how to destroy everything she had built on the bones of his grandfather's dreams. The revenge was about to begin, and it would be surgical, systematic, and absolutely devastating. What would you do if someone called you just to help while standing in a building your family actually built? Marcus Washington was about to teach a racist billionaire that some people's imaginary legacies are more real than her stolen empire. Have you ever been underestimated because of who you are or where you came from? Share your story in the comments below, and if you want to see how one young man's patience and intelligence brought down a corrupt dynasty, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because this revenge story will leave you cheering for justice. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who smile while they plot your downfall. Marcus Washington had learned to smile very well. The morning after Victoria Sterling's humiliation, Marcus sat in his grandmother's small kitchen in Detroit's Corktown neighborhood, surrounded by the evidence of a stolen empire. Newspaper clippings from the 1960s covered the worn wooden table like pieces of a puzzle that had taken 60 years to solve. "Grandpa built the Renaissance Center, didn't he?" Marcus asked, studying a faded photograph of his grandfather James Washington standing proud in front of a massive construction site, his hard hat gleaming in the Detroit sun. "Now listen to this," Grandma Ruby nodded, her weathered hands tracing the edges of the photo with reverence. "Every steel beam, every concrete pour, every detail. Your grandfather's company employed over 200 men, black and white working side by side when that wasn't common. He was going to change this whole city." Marcus picked up a contract dated 1967, his grandfather's signature bold and confident at the bottom. Washington Construction Company had been awarded the contract to build what would become Sterling Tower, the very building where Victoria had humiliated him the night before. "What happened, Grandma? Tell me again. Every detail." Ruby's eyes hardened with 60 years of buried anger. "Charles Sterling was nothing but a small-time real estate investor until he met your grandfather. Jimmy trusted him, brought him in as a partner on the big projects. That man learned everything from your grandfather, the contacts, the methods, the business relationships." She pulled out a folder Marcus had studied countless times but needed to hear again. Inside were bank statements showing how Charles Sterling had systematically drained Washington Construction's accounts while James Washington was focused on building. Forged signatures. Fake invoices. A web of financial fraud so sophisticated it had taken Marcus 3 years of business school to fully understand. "Here's where it gets devastating. Your grandfather was building the Sterling Tower when Charles made his move." Ruby continued, her voice heavy with pain. "Jimmy had put everything into that project, his reputation, his savings, his future. Charles waited until the building was 90% complete, then claimed Jimmy was stealing from the project fund." Marcus felt his jaw clench. "And the newspapers believed him." "Newspapers? Baby, Charles Sterling owned half the media in this city by then. He bought them with money he'd stolen from your grandfather." Ruby spread out yellowed newspaper clippings with headlines that still burned: "Black Contractor Accused of Embezzlement," and "Washington Construction Under Investigation for Fraud." But here's what the newspapers didn't report: the real evidence. Hidden in Ruby's shoebox were photographic copies of documents proving Charles Sterling had forged James Washington's signature on dozens of financial transactions. Bank statements showing mysterious transfers. Most damning of all, a handwritten letter from Charles Sterling to his lawyer, discussing how to eliminate James from his business empire. "How did Grandpa get these documents?" Marcus asked, studying Charles Sterling's handwriting confessing to crimes that had destroyed a family. Ruby smiled for the first time that morning. "Your grandfather wasn't just a builder. He was a planner. When he started seeing money disappearing, he hired a private investigator, a black man named Samuel Johnson who knew how to move through white society without being noticed. Sam gathered evidence for months before Charles made his final move. Now here's the kicker: so why didn't Grandpa fight back?" Ruby's expression darkened. "He tried. But this was 1969. A black man accusing a white businessman of fraud. With no money for lawyers and newspapers spreading lies daily. Your grandfather had two choices: spend years in court fighting a system designed to destroy him, or take his evidence and disappear before they found a way to put him in prison. James Washington had chosen survival over justice, moving his family to Chicago and taking a job as a foreman for someone else's construction company. He died in 1987, carrying the weight of stolen dreams and unfinished business. But he'd left something behind, a grandson who understood both the law and the system. A young man who'd spent 4 years learning exactly how to use Charles Sterling's own methods against his daughter. When a man spends 4 years studying business law for revenge, every lecture becomes a weapon, and every textbook becomes ammunition. 3 weeks after the humiliation at Sterling Holdings, Marcus Washington sat in the Wayne State University Law Library at 2 a.m., surrounded by corporate law textbooks and a laptop screen glowing with Victoria Sterling's company records. But this wasn't just late-night studying, this was reconnaissance. Here's what Marcus had discovered: Victoria Sterling wasn't the business genius everyone believed her to be. Her father Charles had built the empire, but Victoria had inherited it without understanding its foundation. And foundations built on fraud, as Marcus was learning, always have cracks. "You look like you're planning to take over the world," said a voice behind him. Marcus turned to see Professor Diana Martinez, a 50-year-old corporate law instructor who'd been watching his research habits with growing curiosity. "Something like that," Marcus replied, not bothering to hide the Sterling Holdings documents spread across his table. Professor Martinez sat down uninvited, her sharp eyes scanning the papers. "Corporate fraud investigation. Interesting focus for a business student." She paused, studying Marcus's face. "This is personal, isn't it?" Now here's where things get interesting. Instead of lying, Marcus made a calculated decision. He told Professor Martinez everything: the stolen company, the forged documents, Victoria's racist humiliation. He watched her expression shift from skepticism to outrage as he laid out 60 years of injustice. "You have evidence of all this?" she asked, examining the photocopied documents Ruby had preserved. "Every signature Charles Sterling forged. Every bank transfer he made. Every lie he told." Marcus pulled out his phone, showing her photos of the original documents. "My grandfather's private investigator was thorough." Professor Martinez was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled, the kind of smile that meant someone was about to get exactly what they deserved. "Marcus, I want you to know something. Before I became a professor, I spent 15 years as a federal prosecutor specializing in corporate fraud. And what you've shown me isn't just grounds for a civil lawsuit, it's evidence of federal crimes that don't have a statute of limitations when fraud is involved. But here's the beautiful part: Professor Martinez didn't just offer legal advice. She offered something better, a network. I know people, Marcus. Prosecutors who specialize in white-collar crime. Journalists who investigate corporate corruption. Federal agents who've been waiting for a case this clean-cut." She gathered the documents carefully. "But if we're going to do this right, we need more than historical evidence. We need current evidence." That's when Marcus revealed the second phase of his plan. For the past 3 weeks, he'd been applying for jobs at companies throughout Detroit's business district. Not high-level positions, entry-level work that would put him inside corporate offices where he could observe, document, and gather intelligence. "I got hired as a filing clerk at Morrison & Associates," Marcus explained. "They handle legal work for Sterling Holdings. I start Monday." Professor Martinez's eyes widened. "You're going undercover in their law firm?" "I'm going to learn everything about how Victoria Sterling runs her business. Every contract, every deal, every corner she cuts. And I'm betting she's following in her father's footsteps." Now watch this unfold. What Marcus didn't tell Professor Martinez was that he'd also been accepted for a weekend catering position at Sterling Holdings corporate events. Victoria Sterling had humiliated the help without realizing she'd just recruited him to work every important business function for the next 6 months. She would see him serving drinks and clearing plates, never imagining he was memorizing conversations, photographing documents left on tables, and building a case that would destroy everything her father had stolen. Over the next several days, Marcus implemented what he privately called Operation Invisible Man. During the day, he filed legal documents at Morrison & Associates, making copies of anything related to Sterling Holdings. During evenings, he studied corporate law with Professor Martinez, learning exactly which laws Victoria was likely breaking. On weekends, he served champagne at Sterling Holdings events, watching Victoria conduct business with the casual arrogance of someone who believed she was untouchable. But here's what Victoria Sterling didn't understand: the young black man she dismissed as delusional about his family's legacy was about to prove that some legacies are worth fighting for, some debts are inherited by the children of thieves, and some revenge is served with a law degree and 60 years of documented evidence. The hunter is positioning himself perfectly, and Victoria Sterling has no idea she's about to become the prey. While she continues making racist jokes at dinner parties, Marcus Washington is documenting every crime, every conspiracy, every moment of arrogance that will destroy her. But here's what I want to know: when you see injustice happening, do you fight back immediately or do you plan strategically like Marcus? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you're as invested in seeing this billionaire get exactly what she deserves, smash that subscribe button because everything is about to explode. They say the best hiding place is in plain sight, and Marcus Washington was about to prove that theory in the most devastating way possible. Monday morning at Morrison & Associates law firm, Marcus sat at a metal desk in the filing room, wearing a crisp white shirt and black slacks, looking every bit the part of an eager young clerk. What his supervisor didn't know was that Marcus had spent the weekend memorizing the firm's client list, building layouts, and security protocols. Washington, barked Mr. Harrison, the senior partner's assistant. I need these Sterling Holdings contracts filed by noon. And don't mess up the system, everything's alphabetical by date, then by project. Yes sir, Marcus replied, accepting the thick stack of folders. But as Harrison walked away, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. He was about to get unrestricted access to Victoria Sterling's legal documents. Here's what happened next. For 3 hours, Marcus methodically photographed every document in those files. Construction contracts with suspicious markup fees. Environmental impact waivers that had been mysteriously fast-tracked. Most interesting of all, a series of legal memos discussing community displacement strategies for low-income neighborhoods in Detroit. But the real treasure was a folder marked, confidential, VSIs only. Inside were documents showing Victoria Sterling was using the exact same tactics her father had perfected 60 years ago. Forged signatures on zoning applications. Backdated environmental assessments. Bank transfers to city officials that could only be described as bribes. Like father like daughter, Marcus whispered, photographing each page with his phone's high-resolution camera. Now picture this scene. That Saturday evening, Marcus stood in the Sterling Holdings penthouse again, this time wearing his catering uniform and carrying a tray of champagne. Victoria Sterling was hosting a private dinner for Detroit's Planning Commission, the same officials whose signatures appeared on those suspicious documents he'd photographed. More wine for table 3, Victoria instructed him, barely glancing up from her conversation with Commissioner Bradley, a 60-year-old man whose expensive watch didn't match his public servant salary. The riverfront project is moving faster than expected, Commissioner Bradley was saying, accepting his refilled glass from Marcus. Those families should be relocated by next month. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. The riverfront project was displacing 200 low-income families, most of them black, from a neighborhood his grandfather had helped build in the 1960s. Here's where it gets personal, Victoria Sterling laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. Excellent. Once we clear out that element, property values will triple within 2 years. That element. The same dehumanizing language her father had used to justify destroying James Washington's life. But here's what Victoria didn't notice. Marcus had positioned his phone in his shirt pocket, recording every word of their conversation. As he moved around the table serving drinks, he captured Commissioner Bradley discussing which city inspectors could be encouraged to overlook building code violations, City Council member Janet Mills explaining how environmental impact studies could be expedited for the right price, and Victoria herself detailing a systematic plan to force out Detroit's remaining black-owned businesses through strategic rezoning. The beauty of this approach, Victoria explained to her captive audience, is that it's all technically legal. We're not breaking any laws, we're just interpreting them creatively. Marcus almost choked on his own anger. Interpreting them creatively. The same justification Charles Sterling had used when he stole Washington Construction Company. After the dinner ended and Marcus finished cleaning, he sat in his car outside Sterling Holdings, reviewing the evening's recordings. 3 hours of audio evidence of conspiracy, bribery, and systematic discrimination. Combined with the documents from Morrison and Associates, he now had enough evidence to destroy Victoria Sterling's empire and send her to federal prison. But Marcus wasn't ready to strike yet. You see, he'd learned something important from studying his grandfather's downfall. Charles Sterling had been vulnerable because he'd acted alone, trusted the wrong people, and underestimated his enemy. Marcus wouldn't make those mistakes. He was building a case so airtight that when it went public, Victoria Sterling wouldn't just lose her company, she'd lose everything, exactly like his grandfather had. When you've gathered enough evidence to destroy someone, the hardest part isn't pulling the trigger, it's choosing the perfect moment to fire. 2 months into his undercover operation, Marcus Washington had transformed from an angry young man into a calculated strategist. His apartment now looked like a detective's war room, with photos, documents, and audio recordings organized across every available surface. But tonight was different. Tonight, he was making his first public move. Picture this. Marcus sat across from investigative journalist Sarah Chen at a downtown Detroit coffee shop, sliding a manila envelope across the small table. Sarah was a 38-year-old reporter for the Detroit Free Press who'd built her reputation exposing corruption in city government. What you're about to see, Marcus said quietly, will be the biggest story of your career. Sarah opened the envelope and immediately went silent. Inside were photographs of the forged documents from the 1960s, audio transcripts from Victoria Sterling's recent dinner party, and bank records showing payments to city officials. But the crown jewel was a side-by-side comparison showing how Victoria was using identical tactics to her father's fraud 60 years apart. "My God," Sarah whispered, studying the evidence. "This is systematic. Generational. How did you get all this?" Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Let's just say Victoria Sterling underestimated the wrong person's intelligence." Now here's where Marcus's plan got brilliant. Instead of asking Sarah to publish everything immediately, he requested something more strategic. He wanted her to publish a smaller story first, just enough to get Victoria's attention and force her to make desperate moves that would expose her further. "Write about the riverfront displacement project," Marcus instructed. "Focus on the families being forced out and the suspicious speed of the approvals. Don't mention Sterling Holdings by name yet, but make it clear someone with serious political connections is behind it." Sarah studied him carefully. "You're setting a trap. I'm giving Victoria Sterling enough rope to hang herself with." Here's what happened next. The article published 3 days later with the headline, "Detroit Families Face Mysterious Mass Displacement." It detailed how 200 low-income families, mostly black, were being evicted from prime riverfront property through a series of suspiciously coordinated legal maneuvers. The response was immediate and exactly what Marcus had predicted. Victoria Sterling panicked. Within hours of the article's publication, Marcus was back at Morrison & Associates, filing documents as usual, when he overheard a frantic phone call between Mr. Harrison and Victoria herself. "We need to accelerate the timeline," Victoria was saying, her voice tight with stress. "Get those families out now, before more reporters start digging." "Victoria, if we move too fast, it'll look suspicious," Harrison replied. "I don't care how it looks. My father built this company by taking decisive action, and I won't let some bleeding heart journalist destroy what we've worked for." Marcus smiled as he continued filing. Victoria was about to make exactly the kind of desperate mistake that would provide him with even more evidence. And she did. Over the next week, Sterling Holdings fast-tracked evictions, bypassed required environmental assessments, and pressured city officials to approve zoning changes without public hearings. Every illegal shortcut Victoria took was documented by Marcus through his dual positions at the law firm and catering company. But here's the most satisfying part. During a Sterling Holdings board meeting that weekend, Marcus overheard Victoria discussing her final solution to the negative publicity. "We need to discredit that reporter," Victoria told her inner circle. "Find out who her sources are. Threaten their jobs, their family, whatever it takes. These people need to learn their place. These people." There it was again, the same dehumanizing language. As Marcus cleared glasses from their table, Victoria looked directly at him and said, "You there? Make sure no one is listening at that door." "Of course, ma'am," Marcus replied politely. Privacy is very important. If Victoria had been paying attention, she might have noticed the slight smile on his face as he walked away. But people like Victoria Sterling never really saw people like Marcus Washington. They just saw uniforms, skin color, and assumptions about intelligence and worth. That blindness was about to cost her everything she had stolen from his family. This is the moment when patience becomes power, and Marcus Washington starts pulling the strings that will unravel Victoria Sterling's entire world. She thinks she's untouchable, but she's about to learn that underestimating a young man's intelligence was the biggest mistake of her life. If you're on the edge of your seat waiting to see how this plays out, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because the confrontation you've been waiting for is about to happen. The moment when a carefully laid trap finally springs is like watching lightning strike, beautiful, terrifying, and absolutely devastating. Marcus Washington stood in his apartment, staring at the wall of evidence he'd assembled over 4 months of undercover work. Tomorrow was the day Victoria Sterling's world would collapse, but tonight, he allowed himself one moment of reflection on the journey that had brought him here. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Chen, "Story goes live at 6 a.m. tomorrow. FBI raid scheduled for 7 a.m. You ready for this?" Marcus typed back, "I've been ready for 60 years. Here's what was about to unfold. Sarah's investigation had grown far beyond Marcus's initial evidence. Working with Professor Martinez's federal prosecutor contacts, they'd uncovered a conspiracy involving 12 city officials, 8 construction companies, and over $50 million in fraudulent contracts spanning 5 years. But the crown jewel of their investigation was the historical angle. The story would reveal how Victoria Sterling was using identical tactics to her father's systematic destruction of black-owned businesses in the 1960s, making this not just a corruption case, but a civil rights violation with federal implications. Picture Victoria Sterling that morning, sipping coffee in her penthouse office, completely unaware that her empire was about to crumble. She'd spent the weekend intimidating reporters, bribing officials, and threatening families, all of which had been carefully documented by Marcus's network of allies. At exactly 6 a.m., Sarah Chen's story went live with a headline that made Detroit's power structure tremble: Sterling Holdings, a 60-year legacy of fraud, racism, and systematic oppression. The article was devastating. Side-by-side photos of Charles Sterling's 1960s documents and Victoria's recent contracts. Audio recordings of Victoria discussing those people and undesirable elements. Bank records showing payments to city officials. Environmental reports that had been falsified to accelerate construction projects. But here's the most powerful part: the story featured James Washington's photographs and documentation from the 1960s, finally giving voice to a man who'd been silenced for 60 years. Victoria Sterling's phone started ringing at 6:05 a.m. Investors, lawyers, board members, city officials, everyone wanted answers she couldn't provide without incriminating herself further. At 7 a.m. sharp, FBI agents served search warrants at Sterling Holdings headquarters, Victoria's penthouse, and Morrison & Associates law firm. Marcus watched from across the street as federal agents carried out boxes of evidence he'd helped them identify. Now here's where it gets satisfying: Victoria Sterling, the woman who'd called him delusional about his family's legacy, was about to learn exactly how real that legacy was. Agent Patricia Rodriguez, the lead FBI investigator, had been personally briefed by Professor Martinez about the historical significance of the case. She wasn't just pursuing financial crimes, she was correcting a 60-year-old injustice that had destroyed one of Detroit's most successful black-owned businesses. By 9 a.m., Victoria Sterling was in FBI custody, charged with conspiracy, fraud, civil rights violations, and racketeering. The same RICO statutes used to prosecute organized crime were now being applied to her systematically racist business practices. Marcus received a call from Agent Rodriguez. "Mr. Washington, we'd like you to come in and provide your testimony. Your undercover work was instrumental in breaking this case." As Marcus walked toward the FBI field office, he thought about his grandfather James Washington, who died believing justice would never come. About his grandmother Ruby, who'd preserved evidence for 60 years hoping someone would care enough to use it. The media response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the story was national news. Detroit woman arrested for continuing father's 60-year campaign of racial economic terrorism. FBI breaks up generational conspiracy targeting black businesses. Victoria Sterling's mugshot appeared on every news channel, no longer the untouchable billionaire, but just another criminal who'd finally been caught. But Marcus wasn't finished yet. The arrest was just the beginning of his revenge. He had one more devastating surprise that would ensure Victoria Sterling understood exactly who had orchestrated her downfall, and why. Sometimes the most devastating truths are delivered not with anger, but with the quiet dignity of someone who has finally reclaimed their power. 3 days after Victoria Sterling's arrest, Marcus Washington sat in the FBI's Detroit field office, giving his final testimony. Agent Rodriguez had been impressed by the meticulous evidence he'd gathered, but she had one last question. "Mr. Washington, there's something I need to understand. How did you know exactly where to look, exactly what documents to photograph, exactly which conversations to record?" Marcus smiled and pulled out a worn leather journal. "My grandfather may not have been able to fight Charles Sterling in court, but he spent the last 20 years of his life documenting everything Sterling did wrong. Every bribe, every forged signature, every illegal shortcut. He was preparing for someone to continue the fight." Here's what Marcus revealed: James Washington hadn't just collected evidence of his own destruction, he'd created a blueprint for how Charles Sterling operated. Every tactic Victoria had used was predicted in her father's patterns, documented in James Washington's meticulous notes. "So when I saw Victoria using the same methods," Marcus explained, "I knew exactly where to look for evidence because Grandpa had already mapped out how the Sterling family conducted business." Agent Rodriguez shook her head in amazement. "Your grandfather was building a case for 60 years. He was building justice for 60 years. Now picture this scene. That afternoon, Marcus received an unexpected call. Victoria Sterling's lawyer wanted to arrange a meeting. She was willing to discuss a plea agreement, but she insisted on speaking with Marcus directly. Why would she want to see me? Marcus asked Professor Martinez during an emergency strategy session. Because she finally realizes who you are, Martinez replied. And she's probably going to try to buy you off or intimidate you one last time. The meeting took place in a sterile conference room at the federal courthouse. Victoria Sterling sat across from Marcus, no longer the polished billionaire but a broken woman facing 20 years in federal prison. Her platinum hair was disheveled, her expensive makeup couldn't hide the exhaustion in her eyes, and her hands trembled as she spoke. "You're him, aren't you?" Victoria said quietly. "You're James Washington's grandson." "I am." Victoria stared at him for a long moment. "That night at the party, when you said your grandfather built this city, you weren't delusional. You were telling the truth." "I was telling the truth about a lot of things you chose not to hear." Here's where Victoria Sterling finally understood the magnitude of her mistake. "How long have you been planning this?" "Since I was 12 years old and my grandmother first showed me the documents proving your father stole our company." Marcus leaned forward. "But I started actively planning 4 years ago when I enrolled in business school to learn exactly how to destroy you legally." Victoria's face went white. "You've been planning this for 4 years. I've been planning this my entire life. Every slight you've ever made against black people, these people comment, every assumption about our intelligence or worth, I've been documenting it all." But here's the most devastating revelation. Marcus pulled out his phone and played a recording from that first night at Sterling Holdings, when Victoria had called him delusional about his family's legacy. "I recorded everything. Every racist comment, every casual cruelty, every moment you thought you were untouchable." His voice remained calm, professional. "My grandfather taught me that the best revenge isn't emotional, it's methodical." Victoria Sterling began to cry, not tears of remorse, but tears of someone who finally understood she'd been outplayed by someone she'd considered inferior. "What do you want?" she whispered. Marcus stood up, straightening his tie with the same dignity his grandfather had maintained even while being destroyed. "I want you to understand that when you humiliate someone because of their race, you don't know who you're dealing with. I want you to know that some families don't forget, and some debts get passed down through generations." He walked toward the door, then paused. "And I want you to spend every day in prison remembering that the delusional black boy you mocked was actually the smartest person in every room you shared with him." 6 months later, justice had been served with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a grandfather who'd waited 60 years for his legacy to be restored. Marcus Washington stood in the lobby of what was now called Washington Tower, watching construction crews install the new signage. The building Victoria Sterling had claimed as her family's achievement now bore its rightful name, a monument to the black entrepreneur who'd actually built it decades before. Here's how completely Victoria Sterling's world had collapsed. The federal investigation had uncovered corruption involving over $200 million in fraudulent contracts. 12 city officials were indicted, 8 construction companies lost their licenses, and Sterling Holdings was dissolved entirely, with all assets being liquidated to compensate the families who'd been systematically displaced. Victoria Sterling herself received 18 years in federal prison for conspiracy, fraud, and civil rights violations. But the most devastating blow wasn't the prison sentence. It was watching everything she believed belonged to her family being rightfully returned to the people they'd stolen it from. "Mr. Washington," said Janet Torres, the federal prosecutor who'd handled Victoria's case, approaching Marcus in the lobby. "The restitution payments have been finalized. Your family's legal claim to the original construction contracts has been validated, and you're now the primary beneficiary of the Sterling Holdings liquidation." Marcus nodded, but the money had never been the real goal. "What about the families who were displaced by the riverfront project?" "All evictions have been reversed. The city council voted unanimously to provide new housing and compensation for the families affected. They're calling it the James Washington Community Development Initiative." Now picture this moment. Marcus walked through the penthouse office where Victoria Sterling had once held court, mocking him as delusional about his family's legacy. The space was being converted into the James Washington Community Center, offering free business development resources to minority entrepreneurs. His grandmother Ruby, now 87, sat in the office's main chair, her weathered hands touching the desk where her husband's stolen dreams were finally being restored. "Your grandfather would be so proud of you," Ruby said, tears streaming down her face. He always said the truth has its own power, and it would speak when the time was right. Marcus knelt beside his grandmother's chair. "We did it, Grandma. We got it all back." But here's the sweetest part of the revenge. Marcus had received a letter from Victoria Sterling in prison. 3 pages of desperate handwriting, trying to justify her actions, minimize her father's crimes, and somehow position herself as a victim of circumstances. The letter ended with words that would have been laughable if they weren't so pathetic. "I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me. I was raised to believe certain things about people like you, but I realize now I was wrong." Marcus had shown the letter to Professor Martinez, who'd read it with disgust. "Even in prison, she still can't take full responsibility. I was raised to believe, as if racism is something that just happens to you instead of a choice you make every day." Marcus had thrown the letter away without responding. Some people didn't deserve forgiveness, especially when they only apologized after facing consequences. The real victory came in the form of phone calls and emails Marcus received daily from young black entrepreneurs who'd heard his story. Law students, business majors, community organizers, all inspired by proof that systematic injustice could be fought and won through intelligence, patience, and unshakable determination. "Your story changed my life," wrote one young woman from Chicago. "I was about to give up on my business degree, but seeing how you used education as a weapon for justice made me realize knowledge really is power." As Marcus sat in his grandfather's restored office, surrounded by photographs of the buildings James Washington had constructed throughout Detroit, he realized the revenge had become something bigger than personal satisfaction. It had become a symbol that some wrongs could be made right, some stolen legacies could be reclaimed, and some debts really did get paid in full. Victoria Sterling had called him just the help and mocked his family's legacy as imaginary. Now she would spend the next 18 years in a federal prison cell, remembering every day that the young black man she'd underestimated had systematically destroyed everything she thought made her powerful. And Marcus Washington would spend those same years building something his grandfather would have been proud of, a legacy based not on what was stolen, but on what was earned through brilliance, persistence, and the kind of quiet dignity that can never be taken away. Marcus Washington's story proves that justice doesn't always come fast, but when it comes with patience, intelligence, and unshakable determination, it comes complete. Sometimes karma is generational. What Charles Sterling stole from one generation, his daughter Victoria would lose to the next.